Good afternoon. My name is Ritter Kauffman. The governor of New York calls me the energy czar, and I hope that I wind up better than the other czars in what we're trying to do. So I'd like to talk to you about the power electricity sector. And you saw already today that at 40%, it's the largest use of energy in the United States. And like the other topics we've discussed, there's very little public understanding about the electricity sector, or for that matter, the regulatory structure. Somebody not long ago said to me, well, what is all this stuff about coal? Why don't we just use electricity for it? So we don't use oil to produce electricity in the United States, for example. We do use natural gas. And electricity, as you've heard, is generally produced in large power plants far away from population centers. And the nature of that, in terms of the historical production of power, is 2/3 of the energy content is lost in conversion to electricity and transmission and distribution until we use it. And that number is arguably understated. So your mother was right when she said you should shut off your light bulb. Regulatory authorities are shared between the federal government and the state government, and I would actually say that state governments loom very large. And that's why I'm here today, because changes are really happening in the electricity sector. And as Judge Brandeis said, that states are laboratories of democracy. States really are acting because the federal government is not yet. So what's happened is generation costs are declining because of the benefits of lower natural gas prices, but transmission and distribution costs are going up. And so in fact, in New York, we pay some of the highest electricity costs in the country because we have an older transmission and distribution system. So at the same time that we have the cost of this central station, as Arun said, the architecture of the grid that Edison helped devise, at the same time that cost continues to go up, the cost of distributed solutions go down. And we talk about distributed solutions, it's not just solar, it's not just batteries, it's everything. It's fuel cells, and it's also the ability to produce combined heat and power using natural gas. And so when you think about things, sometimes it's cast as a conflict between renewables and fossil fuels. You should really instead think about this as a tension between central station production and the role of distributed generation. Because you're not going to build a coal power plant next to your office, but you can put in a gas power plant. So what do we've got? We're building a patchwork system in New York State and everywhere else in the country with some distributed solutions. Solar is a really good example. Grafted on top of this main grid central station production system. We're not building a real network. We're not building the network of the future that looks a lot like the IT system. That's how it ought to look, where the mainframe is the equivalent to the central station, and just like we have PCs, we have distributed energy solutions. That's how the grid ought to be built. And everyday utilities are spending money on the grid, but they're just rebuilding the old grid. We're not building the new grid. So that's what we're doing in New York. We've taken this on a challenge and to fundamentally change the market and regulatory structure. Because while there's a lot more technology to be done, there's plenty of good technology to begin this today. And the technology will only get better. So our objective is to have this be a market-based approach. The role of government is to remove market barriers and change regulatory structures. And utilities are regulated businesses, and they will optimize their business according to the rules. So we're in the process of changing the rules. So when we talk about utilities in New York State, states are different in this. So utilities in New York State do not own generation. So it's just the transmission and distribution system. They do not get paid, there's decoupling, they do not get paid anymore based upon how much electricity you use. Sometimes there's a confusion about utilities getting paid more. We have decoupling. Utilities are completely indifferent to how much electricity we use as customers. So what we've told the utilities, and this is the requirement now, as of 2 weeks ago, is that of course, their job is to continue to provide electric service, but we expect more. We are expecting them to manage and build a platform that's going to do more than what they've done in the past. And the first thing that they have to do is they have to optimize capacity utilization. So capacity utilization, you can think about it like any other factory. The capacity utilization of the electricity system in New York State is 55%. That means that the system, on average, is idle half the time. It's built for the hottest few days of the year. And the number is actually getting lower and lower as peak demand for electricity increases. And this number is true, more or less true across the country. So there's been a revolution in the last 30 years in American business about improvement in efficiency of capital. It's involved a change in technology, it's involved a change in financial incentives, and involved a change in business models. It has not come to the electric utility sector. And why is that? It's because there's been no requirement, because utilities are in a kind of golden cage. They're protected from regulation, they don't need to change, but now they have to change in New York. So they can improve their capacity utilization by shaping the load. The technology exists to shape load. Your washing machine, dishwasher, and air conditioning do not all need to go on exactly at the same time. They can be shaped. Technology exists to do that. We can integrate more distributed resources, because distributed resources inside, if we're pumping electricity over long distances in areas like New York City, which are very grid constrained, by having more local generation, it will improve the capacity utilization. And really, the thing to think about is that we actually have not only an energy inefficient system, we also have a capital inefficient system. And when we think about how we're going to finance this new infrastructure, there's actually plenty of room in the existing bill to do it. We don't need to have extra subsidies in which to do it. The money is there if we can reshape and change the incentives. So the platform is, we're saying to utilities that they can't own distributed energy solutions, except with very rare exceptions. This cannot be part of the monopoly. And the reason for that is, the whole reason we have monopolies is that the collective is cheaper than the individual. Well, these distributed energy solutions are increasingly, the individual is cheaper than the collective, so they should not be a monopoly. But it's even more important than that, because we don't get up in the morning to use more electricity. It is what we do with electricity that matters. And we're really at a time of, takes us back to the time of Edison, where Edison thought that the electricity system was going to be about lighting, and lighting is, after all, an amazing invention, but we've used electricity for a lot more than lighting. And the thing about these distributed energy solutions is that they're located around customers. And we really don't know what these distributed technology solutions around customers can provide in the way of enhanced value to us in terms of how we use electricity. And we use electricity for entertainment, for health, for convenience, for all kinds of things. And we really have the opportunity now to reimagine and reinvent the way we use and get electricity and get more value out of the electricity system than we have. So just give you one example. There are companies that are looking at home health care because it'll be cheaper and better quality care. So what would that take? That'll take a home automation system for sensors and things like that. It's going to take more resilient power. So that home energy system will be a backbone, And part of what will make the economics of that service be, what will make that economic model, business model to the healthcare provider is going to be the services that that system can provide to the overall grid. But the customer's motivation is going to be healthcare. And you can imagine the same thing in terms of entertainment and other things. So it may be that the path to reducing emissions isn't going to be telling people that they should save money or to save the planet, but it could be improved entertainment, improved convenience, and it's okay if people do the right thing for, as it were, the wrong reason. And this is happening, by the way, today. Already in New York, in Brooklyn, there's a load growth, and the conventional approach for Con Ed would have been to spend over $1 billion on a new substation. And instead, they're using a series of distributed solutions and energy efficiency that will cost hundreds of millions of dollars less. So it will save ratepayers money and be more energy efficient. So this is going to require a major change in utility culture and business model. Because right now, the way utilities earn profit is by committing capital. That's the only way they make profit. The more capital, the more profit. And we're telling them they need to be more capital efficient. We want them to integrate distributed energy resources. Today, when you want solar, they're not getting paid for integrating solar into the system. It's a compliance matter. We want them to procure energy efficiency. The demand response market. That's, again, they just have to, today it's not a business, they just have to do it because the regulator tells them to do it. We don't want utilities to try to own the customer. They have to view third-party like solar providers not as competitors but as partners and customers. So it means really changing how utilities think about their business to earn fees as opposed to just putting capital to work to really get a return on human capital as opposed to physical capital. It's also going to require change in these third-party providers like solar companies, and they also need to view utilities as customers and partners too. And it requires the environmental groups to, some of them, to not be suspicious of markets. Because we can't do what we need to do just on the basis of mandates and grants. It's going to require one other thing too, which is going to require a different approach to finance. And this is where we're going to talk briefly about our billion-dollar green bank. Because the capital that's going to go in, this innovative capital that's going to come in from third parties that are going to bring innovation to the market to figure out what it is that we want from this distributed energy solution, this isn't going to go into the so-called regulated rate of return. It's not going to be provided by the monopoly. It's going to come from competitive markets, and therefore it has to be financed in competitive markets. And it's going to be, some of the companies are going to be small companies that don't have balance sheets, and they're going to be big companies that have balance sheets that don't want to be banks. So where's the money going to come from? It's going to eventually have to come from capital markets, but capital markets are still very inefficient. We know that financing can really matter. The solar lease revolutionized the residential solar market, and these innovative energy solutions people are going to want to pay for them on an ongoing basis. They don't want to come up with the upfront capital cost. That solar lease is the great exception to the world. Most of the time, what we're requiring customers to do is to come up with the upfront capital cost, which may have benefits over time, but it's not the way we consume electricity services. We pay our bill every month, and that's how the new energy services need to be provided too. So the financing is going to have to come really, it's going to have to be financed based upon contracts that customers enter into. But banks have difficulty providing financing under new capital rules It's difficult for banks to lend to small projects that have long maturities. And so if you have limited use of capital markets, bond markets, and you have limited use of, or limitations in bank balance sheets, it can cause difficulty in obtaining financing. And that's where the Green Bank comes in. So our Green Bank is not really a bank. It's, think about it as a specialized finance company. It doesn't offer a subsidy, but instead works with private sector partners to fill in gaps that exist in private sector financing markets. So a good example is batteries. So right now, batteries, even at today's cost, in commercial buildings in New York City, make tremendous economic sense because electricity can be very expensive. Their customers are exposed to what's called time of use pricing. But today, customers have to come up with the upfront capital to put in the battery system. So it makes sense to have a financing solution like a solar lease, where you just lease the battery system and pay as you go. Problem is, you can't get bank financing for that. But in fact, banks have said, we're really interested in this market, but after you have put together a $50 million portfolio of loans, then we'll be interested in participating. And that's an example of the kind of financing product that we can provide. We can fill in, whether it's a warehouse facility or subordinated debt or some kind of credit product, wherever is needed, we can fill in this financing gap. And the bank has been open bank opened in February of last year, and by October we announced commitments of $200 million that are leveraging $600 million of capital for projects in New York State. I worked at the Department of Energy before I came to New York State, and one of the challenges in government is when you're providing financing is how do you know stuff wouldn't have otherwise happened without you, this question of additionality. And when you charge for your capital, as we're doing, it's a market test. It means that they wouldn't be paying us, the private sector wouldn't be paying us unless we're providing value. So that $800 million of projects would not be happening unless we were in the market. So I just want to leave you with the point that change is happening today. I don't think that in terms of stuff that we heard this morning is adequately reflected in terms of what's happening in the electricity sector, in terms of the changes in technology, the changes in cost, because what this change is going to mean is an energy system where supply and demand are better matched than they are today. And that's how we're going to achieve more of our energy efficiency goals. It's going to have more use of distributed solutions that includes the use of natural gas. And it's going to provide more value to batteries, which may have implications for transportation. And the point about this program and this policy is that it's pro-growth, it's pro-consumer, it's pro-innovation, and as its result, it will have lower emissions, that it is not driven based upon mandates to lower emissions. And so we believe actually we're going to be able to achieve our objectives under 111D through this plan animating markets. Thank you very much.
All righty, thank you, Richard, for teeing up what I hope is going to be a fantastic conversation here. I just did some quick math, and while some people think of the sort of the clean power sector as being relatively young, particularly compared to some of the other topics that have been on the agenda, I think that we've got probably 110 years of cumulative experience in the clean power sector on the stage, so hopefully we can impart to you some sort of a little bit of experience, a little bit of wisdom, and certainly some enthusiasm for where the sector is. Just footnote, I took credit for 30 years of that, okay? So Richard is blazing trails in this electricity sector, which is undergoing huge revolutionary change. He mentioned Brooklyn. There's a whole bunch of other things. The technology panel teed up a whole bunch of the technology opportunity, but technology doesn't happen absent finance, market instruments, and policy. And so what we'll do here, hopefully, is create some memorable things that you'll go away and talk about tonight during your dinner discussions and tomorrow and talk to your friends about. And I've asked the folks here on the stage to think about clean power by the numbers. What's one stat from the recent statistic that you'd like the audience to remember about the clean power sector? So let's start with you, Ira.
Thanks, Cathy. Richard said change is happening today. He couldn't be more right about that. Two numbers, 2,200 and 2,200%. Solar power installations are up 2,200% in 2014 compared to 2008, and solar installations are happening every 2 minutes in this country compared to every 2 hours a decade before.
Got that? Pretty good. All right, Ahmad.
Cost of solar in India is competitive this year with imported coal. It will be 20% lower cost than imported coal by 2020. And that assumes a 12.5% debt cost in India, because you have a 350 to 400 basis point loss for foreign exchange. That means if you're able to solve that, solar will be cheaper than coal today by 20%, and by 2020 by around 35%.
Brilliant. Ray.
Well, we've talked in the technical panel about how much prices have declined over the last decade. So our economists all told us about supply and demand. So when the supply costs decline, demand goes way up, and that's what we've seen globally. I think we have visibility to about 50 gigawatts a year globally of deployment. And whereas 10 years ago that was all in Spain and Germany's not that sunny, if you didn't know that. And so it was all policy and feed-in tariff driven. Now you've got explosive growth not only in North America and South America, but in Asia, Japan, China, Southeast Asia, and particularly India, and then of course in Brazil and South Africa. So you've got globally diversified demand at or through grid parity.
Bill.
I've got a few numbers, 30, 20, 2, 1, and 2. And so,
All right, so for you pattern recognizers, you got it?
and 35, that's the last one. So it's going to be very quick. In 2010, Colorado went to a 30% renewable energy standard. By 2020, with a 2% rate cap, that was all that was going to be allowed, and our investor-owned utility is going to meet that. In addition to that, we took a gigawatt of coal out of commission and made it natural gas, so it's a gigawatt of gas, and that's going to cost consumers about $2 a month on average on their bill. That is going to allow Xcel to reduce their emissions from 2005 levels by 35%. Between the 30% renewable energy standard and the coal to gas, they have a 35% reduction in a 15-year period.
Mr. Reicher.
$38 trillion and $5 billion. $38 trillion is what the International Energy Agency says we're going to have to spend to meet global energy demand between now and 2035. We can do it smart and do it clean. If we do, we can both do good and do well. $5 billion is what the clean tech VC world spent in its best year helping to advance early stage clean energy technologies. $5 billion is the price of about 2 large wind farms. So too often when we talk about clean energy, we immediately talk about venture investing. Venture investing, very essential at the front end, but the big money measured in hundreds of billions, and as you saw, trillions, has also got to flow.
I mean, Dan raises a good point. What we've got here on the stage is our folks that are participating in different parts of the innovation ecosystem. If you had the previous panel, we've got the research, we've got all of the good work that NREL and others are doing on the research end. And then we've got Ira, who's an early stage investor. We've got Ahmad, who's scaling. We've got Ray, who's making sure that the transactions take place. And we've got Bill, who's actually worked very, very much to make sure that the policy settings are good. And Dan and I just try to help it all happen from where we sit at Stanford at the moment, I think. But it's really, really fun. One of the things that we used to do when my kids were growing up is at dinner time, we would do highlight, low light. And they had to sort of give their highlight of the day and their low light of the day. And if they didn't answer within 30 seconds, they got tossed in the pool. So we'll do the same thing here, highlight and low light of 2014, because it is a bumpy road sometimes, and there are things that are terrific, but it's not all a bed of roses. So again, how about if we go in a slightly different order? We'll start with Bill.
Oh, no. I think 2014, the highlight for me has been to be able to work on the Clean Power Plan with 13 states in the West, so 8 Republican governors and 5 Democratic. We can talk more about the Clean Power Plan, but just getting it out there, and then in spite of some political opposition to it, to find people in the Intermountain West, the Pacific Northwest, the Dakotas that actually want to work on how this could be implemented and address issues. So that's the highlight. I think the low light is how much, and I work in the policy arena, I work with states, I've done some things at the federal level, but there's a real pushback on the policy side. There's, I think, increasing difficulty finding common ground inside state legislatures that really are trying to address clean energy policy advancement. And so we've seen templates for rolling back renewable energy standards, rolling back energy efficiency resource standards. We've seen battles over net metering that were more ideological battles than they were really about practical or economic or even I would call sociological challenges.
Good. Ray.
I think to Dan's point about going from venture capital to deployment capital, or making sure these scalable technologies are deployed at a utility level, which is one of the biggest industries in the world. We've seen incredible advances in that over the last 12 months with the emergence of what's euphemistically called a yield co. It's equivalent to a MLP, or master limited partnership, but is done with a C Corp, and it leverages the tax benefits embedded, at least in this country, with the deployment of renewables, and it provides a very stable return for shareholders. It's been explosive in popularity. There are 5 or 6 public companies now, another 7 or 8 that are on the drawing board or filing registration statements. And we're talking about, the MLP industry is probably $600 billion. This industry is probably in total about $20 billion today. So the explosive growth is yet to come. That's really the highlight, that we've got efficient capital markets to make sure we've kept the cost of deployment as low as possible. Policy uncertainty is certainly a challenge. There is still market uncertainty out there. If you looked at oil price declines we've seen over the last several months and what it's done to clean tech stocks generally, there's a correlation that people have always used, but the causality is much more of a frayed discussion. So there's much less of a direct link with where oil prices are specifically to where solar prices should be. But that's still a misconception of the market that time should heal.
So your low light is about the market impact of the oil price decline?
Right.
Okay, gotcha. All right. Ahmad, did he steal your highlight?
He stole my highlight, but I'll tell you the low light then. Because the highlight is the yield co, because we've done one.
Yeah, the yield co is a big highlight.
The low light for me is we never think about the iPhone as something supported by the Democratic Party and the Republicans are against it. And for me as a solar technologist, solar is a technology. It's not a political statement. And I wish we can depoliticize the process and everybody uses it because it's the best thing. It's the cheapest technology, cheapest cheapest energy cost in the world.
Ira?
Yeah. 2014, Tesla named by Consumer Reports as the best overall car in the world. For the 2nd year in a row, after Motor Trend magazine and Automobile magazine named it the best overall car as well last year. Why is it significant? It's not just because it's an iPad on wheels, faster acceleration than any other car. There's so many reasons why it's a great car, but it wasn't named the best electric vehicle. It was named the best vehicle. And that's really what this panel and what this is all about. It's about getting rid of the old historic notion of trade-off. We used to think of electric cars as something that looked like a golf cart, went 30 miles. And if you wanted to do something good for the environment and drive an electric car, you had to undergo that notion of trade-off. And when we think about the metrics that you heard in Cathy's first question, it was all about how these metrics are changing from the or, do you do something that's economic or good for the environment, and getting rid of that notion to the and. And it's really so much of the great policy work that's been done combined with the innovation that has happened that is enabling us to finally get to this inflection point where a number of these technologies are not just getting to be at cost parity, but over time cost superiority, as Ahmad was referencing. So I think it was really important that in a relative blink of an eye after a century of an internal combustion engine paradigm, that the electric vehicle has really reached that stature.
Low light?
Low light, solar rich state like Arizona, largely for political reasons, still getting 40% of its energy from coal.
All right, Dan.
Highlight. 5 days into 2015, I hope that's okay.
All right.
Governor Jerry Brown gets up and gives his State of the State address, and he says the following. We are moving from 33% renewables in our state by 2020 to 50% by 2030. He says we're going to cut petroleum use in the transportation sector by 50%, and we're going to see a major ramp up in plug-ins. Third, he says we're going to improve the efficiency of our buildings by 50%. Now, the president often gets up of either party and gives a State of the Union address and tends to get ignored by Congress. In California, the state legislature is already drafting the bill. Hearings have already been held. Remember, this was January 5th, and the State Public Utility Commission is already beginning to implement it in various ways. So things happen. And 50% that's going to get put into law is a big, big deal. Low light, I think reflecting this, I'm a big fan of government. I've served in 3 administrations. I still am a government junkie, but I'm quite frustrated by the state of gridlock in our Congress and the real difficulties we've got between the Congress and the White House.
You know, it's fascinating to me in the diverse experience sets and day jobs of all of these folks is that policy and politics end up being the kind of the common theme that is a bit frustrating for us. You know, I think we kind of uniformly feel that policy has been so useful and helpful and quite constructive, and yet why are we in the situation? Again, that's a conversation for dinner and for days to come as well.
Dinner with a drink.
Dinner with a drink, very good. All right, I should say that if you've got some questions, write them down on a piece of paper or card, and the people will come through and grab them, and we'll deal with some questions from the audience at the end.
Can I say one thing, Cathy?
Sure.
Just about that politics thing. Pay attention to the states.
Absolutely.
Because while there is such gridlock in Congress, we're finding Republicans and Democrats, not all across the board, but Republicans and Democrats being able to find some common ground, agree on some things. We've seen Republican governors who are absolutely trying to move a clean energy agenda. They may talk about it in terms of economic opportunity and never use the words climate change, but we're seeing that move, and I think that would go back to a highlight, is that we've actually experienced that, and it's a good news piece for the United States.
Red states are turning green.
Well, but it's linked specifically to the business activities that are underway in all of those jurisdictions, without a doubt.
Yep.
Without a doubt.
And the markets are absorbing this uncertainty, but at the state and the federal level, we still have very efficient capital markets in the renewable space, whether it's distributed generation or rooftop solar, notwithstanding some of the net metering rules in certain states and some of the resistance. We're now going to start seeing asset-backed securities for this asset class. As Richard said, these are 20-year leases with credit-worthy consumers, so it's even better than a home mortgage. And that's going to be a tap into a very efficient market to bring costs down. And while there's regulatory headwinds in certain states, the momentum and the cost reductions and the deployment scale is just really going to overwhelm that uncertainty. That's my bullish view of the day. But
Wonderful. So one of the things that the previous panel touched on, and I'd like to talk about it here as well, is what does a utility of the future look like? I mean, and Richard talked about it in his opening keynote for us, what they're doing in New York State, and how are the utilities responding to this new, I would view it as a new opportunity for utilities to offer enhanced services behind the meter. Are utilities the right folks to do that? Certainly we've got on the stage here, companies that are going to be, you're investing in companies that can provide some of those services. You certainly can, you can either sell you to utilities or be the utility, probably, Ahmad. I would love, is there an optimal model for how we should deliver electricity in the future? Why don't we start with you, Dan?
The answer, I think, is we've got 50 states with 50 public utility commissions with 50 different situations involving utilities. You look at a state like Georgia, still a vertically integrated utility, still a system in which rates are set. So is Georgia going to move very quickly to the sort of system we've got, or Richard is building in New York? I don't think so. But in New York, as he said, the uncoupling has occurred, deregulation has occurred, and things like that are going to get driven. Having said both of those things, that is very different states with very different approaches, I do think the big wild card is, of course, distributed energy. That is adding something to the mix that each of these states is going to have to deal with. But I think in the end, they're going to come out the other end with very different approaches.
I'll just pick up on this distributed comment. I think we have a model for what's happening in the computing industry. We had, for a long period of time, a mainframe centralized system that over time became distributed with PCs and ultimately the internet and the cloud. And the analog in the energy industry, if we actually take your question to mean more than just the 50 states and just the utilities in this country, and can think about the notion of what distributed can ultimately mean for other areas of the world, where the cost per mile, particularly where T&D systems don't exist in many areas, that the incremental mile is getting solved through the new kinds of distributed generation that are unfolding right now. And that same migration path from the centralized, we have here one of the largest electrical machines in the world powering the lights above, but over time, it is going to be the analog to the PC and to the distributed architecture that's beginning to unfold, again, as a function of cost and hopefully, as we'll talk about, and as an earlier panel talked about, as a function of storage, becoming a far more economic and viable model.
Ahmad, what do you think?
Actually, I don't have anything to add. The thing that from how the utility is going to be, the main thing is to have the right process to evolve. I think what Richard Kauffman is doing in New York is really brilliant because he's creating a dialogue between the utilities and all other companies, and he's creating rules of how to play. And I think that is a process that is very efficient. It's not important for me to say it's going to be like that. What's important is to have a real fact-based discussion that is good for the society. And I think that's what he's trying to do. I sat down with him. He never favors one versus the other. He just wants the best solutions. And he wants to experiment with things and try ideas and make it competitive. And that's, I think, the most important thing we need to do. What's happening in some states is people are using their political power to crush other people. I think it's wrong.
Do you think consumers care? What do consumers want, right? I mean, again, you guys have run companies where it's actually about consumer choice, but an electron is an electron, right? Or not so much?
I think not so much. I mean, we have our utility, the investor-owned utility XL's in a battle with Boulder, Colorado. They're trying to end their franchise. Boulder is. People say, well, we expect that of Boulder, but I don't think it's just Boulder that, they call it the People's Republic of Boulder in Colorado, but I actually don't think that's going to be, I think that there's going to be more of that in the future because I think people are going to be paying more attention to this connection between the energy that's delivered into their home, carbon, CO2, but also really their ability as a consumer to be able to produce their own power and even load onto the grid and get metered back for it and reimbursed. And we've seen like Georgia, the Tea Party in Georgia was behind a distributed generation bill, a rooftop solar bill that really enhanced it because they like they like to be apart from the grid or off the grid as much as they can. And so I think there are a lot of different reasons that consumers actually are going to weigh in. And I think actually the utilities are paying attention to it. I think Dan hit this when he started talking about utility commissioners. We convened 15 CEOs of utilities in this little convening we did for the White House and made some recommendations on utility business models. And the CEOs basically said, listen, technology is 10 years ahead of utilities, but utilities are at least 10 years ahead of the regulatory community. And we got to do what we can to get the regulatory community caught up in a way that they understand this change is happening. And if it doesn't, it's going to happen from the ground up.
I'd say three things. The first, people want reliable electricity. I think that's the basic thing. Turn a light on, they want it to go on. Second, they'd like it cheap as possible. And third, as much as I would rather not see this as third, I think they'd like it clean. But I think for most people, clean is probably third at this point. If we can make clean relatively cheap, which is we're making great progress at, I think that mix can change. I will go back to Georgia, though, because it's a really interesting situation. Georgia and South Carolina are the two places in the United States where large, advanced nuclear power plants are being built. First time in this country in decades. And There have been challenges, there have been cost overruns. We'll see where it all ends up. But there is a different model for large-scale, zero-carbon electricity. And it's fascinating that you've got the Tea Party pushing solar in Georgia, and you've got large nuclear power plants being built in Georgia, and it's a great country.
Let me tell you. Let me tell you a model that the utility CEOs do not want to follow for the future. And it's a model as we harken back several decades. At one point in time, there was a monopoly around how mail was delivered and how overnight mail was delivered. Then there were some upstarts that came along that the USPS didn't pay much attention to, and all of a sudden FedEx and UPS leapfrogged and picked off essentially the top of the pyramid of the customer base. And those were the customers that actually underwrote the rest of the system. That was actually where the margin was made and enabled the USPS to essentially be economic at one point in time. They ignored the little upstarts, and all of a sudden, the top of the pyramid left. And it's caused the USPS to have a significant economic problem. And that's what the utilities want to avoid. As solar and other types of viable alternatives start to threaten in some small fashion today the monopoly of old, the opportunity is, how do we actually work together? How are there ways where it doesn't follow the USPS model and the former monopolies can still have the same economic model without the good customers, which again, today still underwrite the base customer, don't leave.
You know, it's interesting you say that because feeding on that, you saw NextEra bought Hawaii Electric this summer. Hawaii Electric has 9 to 10% distributed solar penetration. That's probably 8 times higher, 7 times higher than it is even in California, which is, so it's the highest penetration in the market because in Hawaii, you burn bunker fuel to create electricity, so the price of power is much higher. So solar penetration, and it's pretty sunny too. So solar penetration was incredibly high. It was very disruptive for the HECO brand because as they fought it, and they didn't unify, I'm not bad-mouthing HECO, but as they were challenged by all those creditworthy customers leaving and having to spread their fixed cost over a smaller base, it became a somewhat defensive strategy against those new entrants. Exactly. And they looked, their brand was then against change. So I think the utility of the future needs, and what Ritter talked about, what Con Ed was doing, at least as it relates to Brooklyn with a substation, a microcosm, utilities need to get their costs down dramatically because this disruptive change is coming. It's coming very quickly, and they are kidding themselves if they think regulators are going to protect them to high-cost monopolistic practices. They have to make the changes now.
But it's going to have to happen state by state by state. The West has no RTO, only one ISO. California has CAISO, and there's no other, balancing authority in the West. So each one of those states is going to have figure out their own model. The fact that New York is doing it, Massachusetts has had legislation, Maryland's had legislation, other states are considering it. There's legislation introduced in Colorado right now that the PUC would docket, an investigatory docket to look at performance-based utility-based performance, performance-based utility, and the resource planning along those lines. That's state by state by state, and the good news is it's that, and not Congress.
What would make the transition to a grid that's more reliant on distributed resources easier, smoother, more comfortable? Is there something that companies should do that, how should that work so that there's less angst and more let's get on with it?
If we have a lot of transparency in the data.
Okay.
Let me tell you one of the bad things about solar. I mean, at the end of the day, everybody has to be honest to what's right for the society. And one of the bad things about solar, it's haphazardly installed in residential applications and commercial and industrial. But if we have data from the utilities where they would like us to focus more, we will go do it potentially. And if there's some incentives or some kind of balance, we can do a lot more. But today we don't have that data. It's hard to get it. It's all confidential. And we get through a lot of barriers to get to the bottom line. And I think it harms them because what's happening is then we're going to go after only the rich people. And we're going to get the money there and so on and so forth. So transparency of data will be very helpful.
Other thoughts about making it easier? I'd like to just shift. Did you?
No.
Okay. I'd like to shift for a second. We've talked a lot about the United States, but we are, we were talking about Canada and Mexico, and I know you guys are doing lots of international work. What are the international markets that are most exciting and interesting for clean electricity at the moment? I mean, you alluded to India a little bit. Yeah. What do you guys think?
I think that we have a company that's largely focused on India and working with Ahmad on that. India, Africa, and it's because of what I described before. It's in areas of the world where there's not this typical transmission distribution systems as we're used to. The distributed opportunity, particularly coupled with storage, enables an entirely new way of powering people. And so, we're finally seeing economic viability around that model.
Anybody else?
China. China was pretty ambitious when they cut the deal for the agreement with President Obama. It's really questionable if it's achievable to do all that they've said, but they have some ambition around it. They just had the 2 meetings of the 2 Congresses, the voting and the non-voting Congress, and it was really dominated by air quality issues and by public health issues. And to the extent they solve their air quality and public health, part of that has to be through growing the renewable sector. We saw that in a lot of the graphs this morning, but I think there are really serious economic opportunities for everybody around the globe who's participating in this industry to go into China and help them build that out, help with the technology that allows you to build microgrids, to do a variety of things that are smart gridding, and that will make a real difference in their public health issues if they're able to really get to that 25% reduction.
Yeah, they're talking about 15 gigawatts a year in China. That's the policy goal. There are some
gigawatts a year
of solar. I'm sorry, that's both distributed solar and utility scale. There are some skeptics because the grid advancement has lagged somewhat, and it takes you a couple of years to get connected to the grid, and then it takes you a little while longer for the utility to recognize you're connected and start paying you. It's kind of uniquely Chinese. So there is a lag, but the returns are still attractive even looking through that friction cost. India, I think the policy statement, and Ahmad, I think you were probably there when President Obama was there, was about 100 gigawatts of solar in the next 10 years, something like that. So the amount of enthusiasm, I was in Mumbai 3 weeks ago, the amount of enthusiasm, really excitement, the pulse of activity and the amount of capital that wants to come in to be part of that is overwhelming. But when you talk about that type of disruptive change to the grid in an emerging market, there's no question it comes with a lot of policy implications. And there'd be some fits and starts, but the amount of capital and the progress is overwhelming.
But there's something important, I think, to remember. When President Obama and the Chinese premier signed the agreement on climate change not too long ago, I think I'm correct to say that China is going to continue to increase its carbon emissions through 2030. Right. And then it's going to level off and start to bring them down. That's 15 more years. And they will continue to build coal-fired power plants. They will continue to build other kinds of fossil fuel-based power plants. They're going to continue to see those emissions go up. That, I think, takes us back to carbon capture and storage. We can talk about it now or we can get to it. But Steve Cornelli from NRG talked about it in the coal context. Absolutely essential, important here, really essential in China and India because we're going to continue to build coal. But we need to move on from coal, as we heard, to natural gas. We need to move on from natural gas to big industrial output of CO2, oil refineries, cement plants, fertilizer factories. You may not know, ethanol plants produce the purest stream of CO2 on the planet. We need to start capturing CO2 from there and from biomass facilities. We know how to do it. The technology is there to capture it. That's Mitsubishi and Shell technologies, been in place for years. We know at least one way to store it somewhat commercially, and that's the enhanced oil recovery. 5% of all U.S. oil is produced through enhanced oil recovery. We can go on to deep saline aquifers, and we're doing it. Sask Power in Canada finished a plant, it's operating. NRG is building a plant in Texas. Both of these are for coal. Exelon has announced they're building a carbon capture unit on a gas-fired plant. That's a big deal. And Archer Daniel Midland, our biggest ethanol producer, has announced they're building a full-scale carbon capture unit on the back end of an ethanol plant. So this is actually happening. Last, the issue, as you heard, is bringing down the cost of CCS. And I think there's progress happening. We've got to push renewables. We've got to push efficiency, but we've also got to recognize that we're going to be producing a lot of CO2 out of plants existing and to be built, and capturing is important.
But if we're not pricing carbon, why should people be deploying capital to capture it?
Great question. That's part of coming down the cost curve. We've got to come down the cost curve technically, and we've also got to create markets where it makes sense economically to do this. The only place it sort of makes sense to capture carbon today, I'm the first to admit it, is enhanced oil recovery, because you actually get paid for the CO2 to put it in the ground. But absolutely.
I want to say before leaving the question of where in the world we're actually making an impact, we often talk about this as where we make an impact from an energy standpoint. And in some ways, it becomes a myopic discussion. There's been some tremendous initiatives going on to bring power to places in the world. There's been one recently in Africa where ultimately light was given to villages. And of course, there was a tremendous impact on the energy side, but the real impact was on education, was on the incidence of crime. The kind of social and economic development impact was so profound, and yet it started with what was originally thought of as an energy initiative and ultimately became so much more.
I'm going to summarize some of the essence of some of these questions here. One of them has to do with the profitability or unprofitability of renewables. And this morning, I know over breakfast, Ahmad, you kind of delineated where we are now with solar versus the competition and where we're likely to be in 2020, I think it was. If you wouldn't mind sharing some of those figures, I think it'll illuminate some of the questions we got on the cards.
So unsubsidized solar, unsubsidized, that means no subsidy whatsoever in Texas, is around 10 cents a kilowatt hour this year.
Utility scale.
Utility scale. But commercial for us is the same cost because the way we do our operation. And in 2020, it'll be 5 cents a kilowatt hour. And this is because we're vertically integrated. We do the chemicals, we do the modules, we construct the plants, we maintain them, and we own them. We finance them. We think we don't have a clear exact details for 2030. We have views about what things are going to change. We think it'll be in the 2 to 4 cents a kilowatt hour at that time. This does not include the evolution of a yieldco, like Ray said. And a yieldco, in a way, it's a vehicle where you put your power plants there, and the cash flows pays dividends to shareholders. And since the cash flows are grown over time, it's a very special entity to invest in. You have high growth and low risk. It's very rare to have something like this. And the way we have structured it, we basically, after we sell the projects to that vehicle, we still own 50% of the cash flows. So by default, we have doubled the pricing or reduced the cost by 50%. So if you use the same math then, the cost in 2015 is 5 cents in Texas, 2.5 cents by 2020, and 1 to 2 pennies in 2030. With that cost, solar is literally the lowest energy source in the world, including all fuels, all gas, everything, all of the above. And what adds to that, two things. You can install a 100 megawatt plant in 3 months. It's very rare to have any kind of technology that can install a 100 megawatt plant in 3 months. And there's no any fuel risk. So because of that, it looks very enticing. Now, of course, it's intermittent, and I can go on how we can solve these things. They're not that complicated. Only our imaginations will stop us. I want to say one last thing. All massive ideas start as small things. Don't get impressed with big corporations, massive forecasts, all that. All massive ideas start as small things. Google did not exist in 1995. They have a $380 billion market cap, equal to the largest oil company in the world. They did not exist. And my view is, if the math based on physics makes sense, go bet on it. Don't worry at all about where the numbers are today.
Well, to that point, over 20 places right around the world that are where solar is more economic than any alternative. To the point of starting small, on the LED side, we've gone from $50 a lumen to under a penny a lumen over the last decade. We've got the Gigafactory being built right now. It's the largest construction project in the world.
That's for Tesla.
For Tesla. It's the largest construction project in the world, set to double the entire battery manufacturing capacity on the planet today. And it's going to be the second largest square foot building on planet Earth. To the point of starting small, it's a company that wasn't around.
So it's 500,000 cars in a 100 million car industry. 100 million car industry takes 2/3 of oil. It's only one company. If there's 10 companies and all models, you can see how that's going to emerge. The demand for oil will change.
So, Ahmad said 2 cents by 2030. I think that's an amazing trajectory. That's very exciting. I will tell you, there's a 2 cent a kilowatt hour source that exists today in vast quantities, can beat any other energy source hands down, and we don't talk enough about it, and that's energy efficiency. You can, at very low cost, make improvements to buildings that will, at that scale of cost, There are both policy aspects to this and there's finance aspects to this. The policy aspects is that good things are happening. The federal government sets standards for the efficiency of equipment and appliances, more than 50 of them set by the Energy Department, from refrigerators to washing machines and all sorts of other boring kinds of things. And those have come down dramatically, but they can come down further. People talk about low-hanging fruit. Efficiency is the low-hanging fruit, and low-hanging fruit grows back because we're always inventing new efficiency technologies driven by standards and driven by genius. The other policy measures, of course, our biggest source of efficiency opportunity, that's in vehicles. The corporate average fuel economy, CAFE, is taking us to 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025 from where we are today at between 27 and 30. That's a huge, huge efficiency gain. Last quick point. I'm the first to admit that financing efficiency improvements in existing buildings, it's relatively easy to do new buildings, but there aren't many of them. Existing buildings is tough. Every building is different. Buildings often come in small sizes. The creditworthiness of the people who own them or rent them are sometimes questionable. So even though there's this 2-cent source out there, it is hard to get at it. The good news, though, is we're inventing all sorts of new financing tools to get at this opportunity.
Okay, so we got
Commercial-based programs across the country are happening and helping. Wind went from 9 cents a kilowatt hour in Colorado to 3 cents a kilowatt hour over about a 6-year period, too. So it's part of that story.
All right, so we got one quick question from the audience that's for Ray, and then I have one final question that I'm going to ask everybody to answer.
So I'll try to be quick. There was a question in the audience about why Wall Street isn't more engaged with renewable energy. And I think it's probably not a very good job by Wall Street to explain where we are involved. I think after the financial crisis, Wall Street was hiding like a tortoise in the shell. A lot of regulatory pressure, a lot of mistakes in the past, and in fact, renewables were pretty much on a low ebb because the costs were high and the perception of the subsidies were going away. So they were kind of deemed to be white elephants, if you will. Now, Wall Street's very much involved. Of course, there's crowdsourced funding, there's bonds, there's asset-backed securities, but Wall Street's very involved. I'll give you some examples where Bank of America Merrill Lynch is, not as a commercial, but just as an anecdote. We deployed between $1 billion and $1.5 billion of tax partnership capital for U.S. renewable projects. That tends to be because the tax incentives, we have the ability to use them more efficiently than some of the developers, and so we enter into an equity partnership, and that's allowed by the regulators. It's a healthy rate of return for us, and it's very enabling for the renewables developer to deploy the capital. We've also, we have a large commodity trading business, and we've entered into 5 different commodity hedges for large-scale wind farms, primarily in Texas, where the price of electricity is more set by gas and is easier to hedge than some other markets, but we're also turning that to PJM and some other markets as well. And then finally, we do have a structured lending practice that is growing, hopefully growing globally, and trying to keep up with Ahmad and his team. But we've deployed probably $3 billion in the last 12 months, either as an underwriter or as an owner of the loan, and so I think that's been very enabling. Asset-backed securities are coming. The bond market's been a little bit slower because the banks, notwithstanding the re-regulation, have still been providing pretty efficient capital out there. So Wall Street, I think, sees a great opportunity for deployment. Wall Street hasn't been that efficient at funding the new technologies because of the perceived risk and where the regulators want the capital base to be.
Great. All right, final question, and I'd like everybody's thoughts on this because we wrap up here. As a student who will be inheriting this planet in the coming years, what can my generation do to convince older, more conservative influencers in public policy that sustainability and renewable energy use is what we both need and want? Bill, former governor would have gotten this question before.
That's right. Well, I have 4 kids between the ages of 21 and 28, and so they ask me this all the time, right? What do millennials do about this? What do students do about it? And I think part of it is, the culture will change. Embedded in our culture is centralized generation and not really thinking much about electricity beyond the fact that it's affordable and reliable. But I think right now people under 35 across the political spectrum really are thinking about clean energy differently. They're thinking about carbon. They're thinking about climate change. And so ultimately, people are going to have to start losing elections over this issue in Congress. And the most important thing you could do as a millennial is make this an issue with more political intensity. And I mean everybody, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, make this issue something that actually causes folks to have to think about this and articulate a position about it.
Does anybody want to add anything to that? Because that was pretty good.
I'll add innovation. Innovation. Right? I mean, that's a combination of policy and innovation has always ushered in change. And when we look at all the other types of technologies and innovations historically that ultimately convinced generations above them that there was a massive change ahead, it was through the innovations, whether it was the horse and buggy transition to the automobile, all through the technologies of the 20th century. Today, it's all about innovating where we no longer have the trade-off and the partisanship where we have to debate whether it is a function of economics or what we do for this planet.
Government service is essential. It's an honor, and we need to get this. We need to get this next generation. As you and I and Arun talked to all these Stanford graduate students a few days ago, we need to get people to see government service as a positive, not a negative, whether it's the federal level or the state level or the local level.
All right. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Richard.